Welcome to today's webinar titled The Role of LIP in Knowledge Mobilization and Creating Community Connections. My name is Chandrima Mazumdar. I am AMSA's Policy and Research Analyst, and I will be facilitating today's event. Before we begin, as a provincial umbrella association, AMSA acknowledges that BC is on the unceded homelands of the First Nations who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. We recognize the privilege that we have as settlers on this land and acknowledge that AMSA's operation is on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So I would like to begin today's session by introducing our speakers. Today we have Mariam from Surrey LIP and Florentine from the GVLIP Greater Victoria LIP. So today's webinar was created from the feedback that we received from the LIP working group, who strongly felt that knowledge mobilization about community engagement projects that different LIP do is a priority among LIP in BC. Keeping that in mind, we invited Mariam and Florentine to share some of the projects that they have recently undertaken. And so they are here to share what they have done and what they have learned, their successes and their failures. So first, we will have Florentine Rahaj, who is the coordinator of GVLIP at the Intercultural Association of Greater Victoria. And thereafter, we will have Mariam Belgrami. She is the manager of Surrey LIP and a Pakistani Canadian, and she will be sharing the project that they have recently concluded. Now I invite Florentine to take over.
Thank you very much, Chandrima. It's absolutely lovely to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversations that we'll be having. So yes, I'm Florentine Verhaag. I'm the coordinator of the Greater Victoria Local Immigration Partnership, and I'm really delighted to be here. One thing that I want to say just off the start is that some of my earlier slides will go a little faster because it's just some of the information many of you already know, because I really want to make sure I get the time that I have to use that to discuss some of the projects we did and some of the learnings that we did from there. If anything goes too fast, if you want to hear more about a particular project, then please just send me an email at the end of my presentation. You will get my email and my phone number, I think, and you can just reach out and talk to me. So that would be lovely. Next slide, please. The Greater Victoria Local Immigration Partnership brings together individuals and organizations located on the traditional territory of the Wasanic and the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. I arrived here from the Netherlands. I was born and raised in the Netherlands. And as newcomers, settlers, and forcefully displaced people, we are uninvited visitors on this land. And we acknowledge with respect the Songhees, Esquimalt, Tsartlip, Tsekum, Tsawut, Pauquachin, and Tsuk nations whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. We're grateful to live, work, and learn here, and we honor the nations who have always cared for these lands, waters, and air, and continue to do so today. And I think part of this, and I think Mariam will speak more about this in light of her project as well. The land acknowledgement obviously needs to go further than just that. It's also about creating relationships with the Indigenous people in the work that we are doing. Next slide, please. As Chandrima said, the Greater Victoria Local Immigration Partnership is a program of the Intercultural Association of Greater Victoria, who is an immigrant serving organization. You can learn some more here. As I said, I will not linger too much on this. So next slide, please. And here's some more information about the Greater Victoria Local Immigration Partnership that you can look up, and feel free to check us out online as well. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're really starting. what I have done for this presentation is really build it around one of my favorite authors' quotes. So Gloria Anzaldúa is a Chicana writer, or was a Chicana writer. She's no longer with us, unfortunately. And I highly recommend her work. It's very, very thought-provoking. She talks a lot about living in borderlands, which for our work is really interesting as well. But what I have chosen is a particular quote that will frame our conversation. Because at one point at a talk, she says this about alliance work. In collusion, in coalition, in collision. Alliance work is the attempt to reposition ourselves regarding our individual and collective identities. Alliance stirs up intimacy issues, issues of trust, relapse of trust, intensely emotional issues. What may be saving the women of color and white feminist movements may be tension between opposing theories, combined with respect, partial understanding, love, and friendship that keeps us together in the long run. So mujeres, women, think about the carnales, friends or relatives you want to be in your space, those whose spaces you want to have overlapping yours. And she says this in specific to a conference of people who work in women's studies. So that's why that has that particular angle here. But I'm always really fascinated with what she says about alliance work, because a lot of the work we're doing is alliance work, right? And so it's really important to understand how we are positioning and repositioning ourselves and how we're dealing with the challenges that alliances bring. And so what I've been doing is I'm choosing the collusion, and the coalition that's in our title to say a little bit more where we in our work find ourselves colluding or colliding or in coalition. And so hopefully that's helpful to you as well. So before I get into that, I have here 2 slides that list some of the work that the GVLIP has recently done. I am not here going into a lot of detail on these. I'm just mentioning them because I will draw examples of either a collision or a coalition, right, from some of this work that we have done. Feel free, as I said before, to connect with me after if you want to learn more about one individual project. So just to make you aware of some of the work that I will be referring to is a community-wide survey that we did about racism in Greater Victoria that got a lot of responses, and that was a project that we started sort of in-house and then later got an external team to help us with analysis and writing. I also did some immigrant legal needs research through the Department of Justice that was already sort of pretty strongly structured by the Department of Justice, but for the rest, it was work that was fully done in-house. We, with Resilience BC funding, wrote a community response protocol against racism and hate, which again was done mostly within the GVLIP with active members as advisors. At the moment, we're running a media campaign that is called Anti-Racism at Work is Everyone's Job. That was right from the start done with a local agency as a creative team. So that was really a collaboration. And finally, ICA is leading BC anti-racism data legislation consultation sessions. Some of you might have heard about these. These are going on at the moment. That's led by ICA, and I'm really there as an advisor. But there are some lessons that we've learned by doing this work, and so I will refer to that. There's some upcoming research that extends from the legal needs research that I did, which is tentatively called Transitions to Justice, Recent Immigrants' Women's Familiarity with Transition Housing and Related Legal Resources in the Capital Region. And part of what I obviously hope to do is use some of the lessons that I've learned through the previous projects to kind of do as best as a job as I can do on that. So collusion, we'll start with collusion. That's really, in some sense, I find one of the hardest things that we're running into, right? We are part of the systems we are dismantling, right? So we are complicit in that. And one thing that we need to realize off the bat with any of the work that we're doing is that there is no escape to this. There's no neutral, there's no way to make everything nice and comfortable, right? This is something that we cannot undo, this type of collusion in some sense, and that might feel hard. So we run the risk when we do our work, when we work with the community, when we do research, that we perpetuate the system rather than that we dismantle it. And so we have to think very carefully what that means. I added a quote from Audre Lorde, whose lovely picture I added too. And that is a very famous quote, you might have heard it before. Can the master's tools dismantle the master's house? Lorde uses that particular quote with an example of women trying to rise to the top, right? And trying to have their careers that is in a way that's enabled by having other women taking care of their children, right? And so she says, you are implementing a kind of a hierarchy, right? Children's work is still a woman's job, but now it very often becomes the immigrant woman's job, who is your nanny, who takes care, right, of your children, so that you can join the spaces that previously were meant for men only. And so she really wonders, it's like, is this the way to solve the problem of participation? Should we reinstate or keep using these type of hierarchies? And obviously, again, we're using this in a slightly different context, but I think it's really important to keep thinking is like, what kind of hierarchies might we be perpetuating by using a particular method for doing our work, for example. Two examples from our own work is our racism survey was only available in English. And so it did perpetuate, right, the accessibility problems that newcomers have, specifically as a LIP, right? That is something that should concern us. We did not have funding to get it translated, so it's not necessarily something that is easy to overcome, right? So you might have to weigh that. It's like, are we going to do the survey and in English because we don't have funding to translate it well, or are we not going to do it, right? And so sometimes you might make the decision, as we did, it's still important enough to get it out there. We'll make sure that the English language that we're using is checked with some of our link teachers so that it's not, right? We're trying to keep it as simple as possible, direct, right? Don't use not often use words or complicated words, but it still will mean that you're not able to check in with your whole community. And that's something that you need to realize from the start. That's going to be reflected in the results. Another example, with the BC anti-racism data legislation, for example, here we see a particular institution wanting to do better, right? But at the same time, it might make people hesitant to contribute to a conversation, specifically if some of the people who are wanting this information, who you might be critical of, right, in terms of the government in this case, might be present in these conversations. So there was a possibility to invite government officials to these conversations, and we decided to not do that, for example, to think about, give people the space that if they get really frustrated, that they feel free to share that frustration about or if they're getting worried about things the way that BC wants to gather data, that people feel free to really be anonymous and speak and know for sure that this is not going to affect any kind of process or any kind of relationship they might have to the government, right? So those are two examples that we encountered. So ways to disrupt this. Collusion is to be aware of which tools we use, how we use them, why we use them, and who uses them, right? So another tool, part of the survey, obviously, we used a survey to ask people about experiences with racism, and we received emails from some individuals, and also personally was contacted by some individuals that were worried because they said, you're asking us to quantify racism, and racism is not quantifiable. It's not that I check how often I experience racism, like daily, weekly, monthly, couple times a year, right? Rather, as one of our respondents said, racism is like gravity, it's all around me. And so the survey as a tool is going to be limited, no matter which way you use it. And for that reason, we complemented it with community conversations and consultations to hear from people directly. So we did not just have that one tool. In any of the work, we want to center equity-seeking voices, and also really be aware of our histories and understand the context in which we work. Another wonderful quote in that context is from Gloria Anzaldúa, is about putting history through a sieve, to winnow out the lies, to rupture with oppressive traditions. And Anzaldúa there really kind of speaks also about as if it's like carrying a backpack and choosing which tools she wants to keep in it and which tools she wants to get rid of, and maybe which tools are completely new that she wants to, in her case, for example, borrow from her own Indigenous heritage. So this might mean that we have to think creatively about developing new tools, considering other ways of knowing, and take the time to do that well. And obviously it means also that we would want to compensate people who are sharing their lived experience. One thing more to kind of go back to Audre Lorde's quote, I think it's important to realize that this quote about the master's tools does not necessarily mean that any of the tools that are part of an older system are that you cannot use, but you need to think carefully what you're doing when you use that tool. So it's not that we can't use surveys, but it's think carefully whether or not we're just using surveys, the type of questions we're asking, and in all of the things that we're doing, whether or not we are repeating a kind of unequal hierarchy, right? That we want to get rid of, and so that requires a lot of careful thinking, and sometimes we still have to do something even though we might know it's not perfect. Please note that whenever I talk about ways to disrupt or kind of solutions to some of these problems, none of these solutions, right, will always like some of the solutions will not be perfect. Sometimes we really like to get, right, there's a problem, is like, give me the solution. For some of these issues, there's just no solution, right? We'll just have to do the best we can in the particular context that we're facing. Collision, that's a hard word to deal with because there will be confrontations. Doing this work, right, will lead to collision. There's no way around it. And sometimes when we have certain collisions, it actually shows us that we're doing the work well. So if on our media campaign, we're getting trolls, we're getting really angry that we're doing work on anti-racism, right? In some sense, it shows that we're doing our work well because there are just certain people who are not going to like us talking about racism, right? So the collisions that we might have could be with the general public, as with the media campaign, or with those in power who have a hard time dealing with criticism. And right, some people in power actually do want to hear honest critique, but some might not be happy about that, right? So sometimes we might get some pushback or an extremely cautious response. But which I think is even more important is to realize that we might also get into collisions with equity deserving communities, right? And so how are we gonna deal with those types of those kinds of collisions, because we're wanting to do this work, we're wanting to do it well, and then the people who we hope, right, benefit from this work might disagree with the way that we're doing things, right? And so this could be also a difference between being called out or being called in. I'm giving you, again, an example of the media campaign. We had some people, some people from equity deserving communities call us on the choice of models that were used, because not everybody was able to recognize themselves in all models. In one particular case, a member of the Black community here called us out for not having chosen someone who was very obviously recognizable as a Black person. There was actually a Black model in there, but this was someone who was, you could see, as a little bit more ambiguous. Same for not having found a model that was wearing a hijab, for example. And so that's a confrontation, and that's a limitation of the work that you're doing at that point, right? And the question is what you're going to do with those types of uncomfortable conversation. Just like when we were called on, like, hey, this survey is only in English, or this survey asks us to quantify something that is unquantifiable, right? Finally, the collisions also might be within yourself, right? Or in other communities. So doing this work might lead to burnout in equity deserving communities, in yourself, or it might make you really angry, right? It might do a lot with yourself. So there will be confrontations. How are we responding to these confrontations? The prime thing, obviously, right, is to listen, to change if needed, and to really hear people. So we were able to add, for example, a Black hijab wearing model to our campaign, and to particularly lift also Islamophobia up as something to talk about when we're talking about racism in the workplace. So it might mean that you have to do a little bit more work, and really listen to the other person, and apologize, obviously, if something, right, if you did something that really hurt another person, right? When we're listening, I've added another quote by Lynette Utal, who says this really important thing about listening, because one thing that she is worried about is about the what she calls it, the nods that silence, right? So the well-willing person who calls themselves an ally, who wants to listen, but who she feels are really not truly listening. So this is what she says: when I speak, I am tired of getting polite nods that hear me but don't tell me anybody is really listening. I'm tired that my words have been given space, but that they might as well have not been said because they did not get built upon or incorporated into the conversation. So if we're listening but not doing anything with that listening and with the message that we have received, we might as well not have been listening, right? Listening is not a performative act. Listening is actually taking something on and then responding, and changing something in that conversation. When I put the uses of anger there, is do you want to say one thing about there? That's also by Audre Lorde. It's a beautiful essay. It's very short. Highly recommend you reading it, because Lorde says that getting angry when we do this work is fitting, right? We're sometimes too afraid of anger and we think it's not appropriate. But anger is called for when we're talking about really difficult things, and anger can be really what drives us to keep on going. So it's sort of turning things upside down, where we always say, well, just calm down, right? Don't be so angry. No, she actually says, use that anger to forward what you're doing. Put your effort into that. The last one, coalitions, relationships and trust. So with all of this, it's very obvious that you cannot do this work alone, right? So one thing, when I did that legal research, I was actually the one who was doing it alone, and it was a little too much in terms of the capacity I had to do all the little pieces of it. Now, for the next follow-up on that research, the transitions to justice piece, we've built it into the grant writing that there is someone who's helping with note-taking, who is transcribing interviews and things like that, which hopefully will make it go smoother. So realize that right from the point of grant writing, you want to make sure that you write in it all the capacity that you need, and to ask for help and support if needed. Building relationships are therefore at the core. Right? We cannot, if we're wanting to ask for help and support, we do need to have those relationships to call upon. And so we need to start building trust. That means that we need to reach out to people, but also check in with communities. When something is going on in the world that we might think might affect a particular community directly or indirectly, check in, ask how they're doing, and show up for their events, right? If you want people to come to your event, or if you want them to participate in a survey or anything for your projects, show up for theirs, attend their events, listen to them, so that they can see you. They see you all the time, and so they know that you're really there for you're not just taking something from them, right? You're also giving back something to that relationship. Value people's time. Listening, again, it always remains very important to keep doing that. So for the racism report, actually, one collision that we had right in the beginning that was interesting and something that we had not anticipated was that we started, as I said, that project in-house. There were multiple people working on the survey, but then when at one point we brought in an external team of researcher that we specifically made sure that there were people of color-led researchers who were working with the data that we had. The problem was that they had not been part of the early process, right? And so they were working with questions in a survey that were not questions they themselves had helped create or have input in. And so that made things harder for them. And sometimes they were uncomfortable, right? And so we had to have really honest conversations. We had to admit that we should really have reached out to them from the beginning and get their participation all the way through, right? But it also meant that these really important and sometimes difficult conversations that we had in the middle of that process of writing the report were in the end also really useful, because all of us really got together on one page and understood where we were coming from, understood, right, how when you're doing some things through the community, and there, in the beginning, right, there was not the funding to translate. We had not imagined so many people to respond. We thought 100, right, but then there were 900, and suddenly thought, we can't do this. We can't deal with 900 responses ourselves. And so there's ways in which you learn through those steps to, in the end, come up with a really excellent report together. So, but sometimes your coalition has to go through a little bump, right? It has to go like, okay, let's sit together. Why didn't we contact them before? How did this process go, and how do we work from here? Next slide, please. So take the time for the process, for the community, and for yourself. For those of us who, I'm just checking the time too, for those of us who would consider themselves white allies or accomplices or disruptors, whatever term feels most comfortable to you, one thing that's really important, right, or the three things here is we do need to keep lifting up equity deserving voices. but we cannot expect them to always represent and do the work for you. If we're thinking about building trust, building relationships, right? People are getting really tired of constantly inputting and kind of sharing their lived experience. So sometimes they will say no, and that is completely correct. So sometimes they say, I'm just tired, I'm not going to share again, right? That means you have to find your information elsewhere. There is a lot of information out there that we already know, right? We need to be disruptors of particular ways of doing things, but by doing that specifically, if you're like me or white, you should not take up all the space in that type of disruption, and should learn when you step back and when you step forward. And also do the work. Do the work even when it's not recognized. There is, I think, a very necessary skepticism of certain communities towards a sense of performative work on the side of white folks, and they're right about that, right? So do this work, and because it's the right thing to do, rather than do this work to get the praise for it, right? So I have all the way through given you questions to decide that sort of fit some of the work that I've been talking about. And so there's 3 questions really to start thinking about this. Obviously, there's many more questions that we have. And so some of the questions that I have for you are these 3. So how can we change systemic inequalities while often also relying on those systems for other things? As I said, right, it's a really difficult question. There might not be any very kind of clear answer to this, but we always need to ask ourselves, how can we change these inequalities, do this work at the same time, right, while being part of these systems? Other question, if you do not have enough funding or capacity to do a project, what will you do? Continue and somehow make it work, or stop and wait? And those are the type of decisions that we need to, that is our work is all about, right? Sometimes we indeed make the decision to continue, like we did with the survey, because we really thought that it was necessary in our community for them to have some data, right? But also to understand that if we would then publish this data, that the data would always be a little skewed towards the English speakers, and to think carefully about what that means. I can say in hindsight now, we really would like to repeat this survey in the future. I probably next time would choose to make it a little shorter, and have it in different languages available, right? So then you kind of get that balance, because it was very long. It was like 20 minutes for someone to fill it out. So a shorter, more direct survey that then would be easier to translate. That is something that I probably do next time. But right, it takes us first to do the whole thing once to figure those things out sometimes. And sometimes you just have to decide, right? If you think, no, I can't do it in the way that I'd like to. So maybe I have to wait. Maybe I have to see if I can get some more funding. Maybe I have to first connect with some of my community members and carefully kind of figure out, right, when is the right time to do it, so that we have the capacity to do it really well. And finally, how do you reach out to people who are important to doing this work, but who might also be overextended? That is something that I think about a lot, that we end up constantly turning to the same people, right, who are often there, who might also get really tired and overextended and have to take a step back. And so that also shows us that we constantly have to keep working and growing our tables making sure that when a partner steps off, right, for completely understandable reasons, we get to work on we get to work with somebody else. And so really this type of work that we're doing through LIPS requires us always to have an eye on that. So we're focusing on our current partners and we're doing great work, but we also should always think about, right, at one point we might need to bring some new people on because some people will just have to step off. Same, of course, with when we're thinking about reaching out to equity deserving communities, that we need to be really careful to not sort of overload these communities and keep asking, now we want your input on this, and next month we want your input on that, right? We also should really make sure, in terms of building trust, want to share one more thing, right? That we should really make sure that the other's involvement is worth it. And so either compensation, right, is a sort of a clear relation of making something worth it, but also not just in terms of compensation, but also showing results and showing that when you get results, you work with it. Or when you do an event, it's not a one-off event, and then we are keeping going and as if that event has never happened, right? So show that you are doing research, you're asking for their input, and then you keep working, and then you keep building on that, and you can deepen your knowledge and deepen your engagement with these things. That is it for my presentation. I was in the beginning really worried I would go way over time. So I think I'm actually quite within time, which is great, because it actually makes it possible to hear from you more. And I really think that's the actual value of these types of events, is to listen and to get questions. So please don't hesitate to send me questions. Please ask questions in this meeting, but also if there is something specific that you want to know about one of these projects in much more detail, do not hesitate. Just send me an email or find me online. I can also share, I don't think my phone number is here, but I can add the phone number in the chat later, but feel free to check in with me and we can talk more. Thank you very much. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions.
Hi, everyone. If you have any questions for Florentine, you can either put it on the chat box or just feel free to unmute yourself and ask her if there's anything. We don't have a lot of time, but we have about 10 minutes for you to ask questions before we move on to Mariam's presentation.
Yeah, and if I can say one thing about that, I think since I think what Mariam says, I mean, a lot of it will complement each other. So maybe for this first round of questions, ask some questions that are really specific in terms of clarification. And then some of the broader questions, feel free to ask both of us. I see one question pop up in the chat. I can take that. How long has the GVLIP been in progress? Okay, so I have been in this position now a little over, is it 2 years? But the GVLIP was in existence before I came, so I think it is 2016, 2017 that here in Greater Victoria that ICA got that contract. But first it was much smaller. It was a sort of a part-time position when I started as well. And at the moment that I came in, it actually had gone a little dormant, which is also something, it's sometimes a cycle, right, of a LIP. And so part of my work was to re-engage partners and bring them together. So the current work is more like 2.5 years old, but all the setup work, right, has been done quite a couple of years ago. I see another question about whether or not we have engaged Indigenous communities. Yes, so I have the CEO from an organization called Indigenous Perspective Societies sits on one of my tables, but that's particularly also one example where I feel that I worry sometimes that I overburden her, right? That because she is at the moment at the table the only person who directly represents an Indigenous organization. And so I want to, this is one of my projects, to kind of widen that a little bit, and so that it's not right, that she's not so like called out in that sense. We are, as ICA more broadly, we're actually going through a multi-year process, the Indigenous Journeys project, which is really about also bringing Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous relationship and history throughout all the work that we're doing as an immigrant serving organization. And so that's a really fascinating process. That's my director is responsible for. And so if there's anybody interested in that, so we had a year long where there was an organization coming in and some consultants to really give us some feedback on how we're already doing. And then based on that feedback and that analysis of how IC is doing, we're now working through these steps to sort of fill in where the gaps needed to be filled. And it's a really valuable process for everybody, every single employee at ICA. So I'm more than happy to connect you to someone at ICA who's been more directly involved in that whole process from the beginning, because I highly recommend it.
We have one more question, Florentine.
Okay. Well, one thing that I've noticed is that the racism survey report, right, which started very small and then grew beyond our capacity, and then we brought people in, and then there was some kind of way of figuring out how we established that relationship, and then we finally published a report with all of us together, and really overcame some of that. That report keeps making important contributions, I think, to the community. We keep being asked to speak about it. Recently, I was asked to sort of interpret and speak about the results in the context of education at the University of Victoria to a whole bunch of staff members, from which we got a lot of good feedback. So really people starting to incorporate that and think about that. We've seen, so for example, we found that 71% of individuals in the community, of racialized individuals in the community, say that they experience racism here. Those types of numbers, and that's about, right, that's a majority of them experiences at the workforce, right? That's where it most often happens. People shared with us, but that they hardly speak up about this because for all kinds of reasons, right? People don't want to risk their work, or don't want to be seen as troublemakers and things like that. But that type of information we keep seeing now popping up, and other organizations starting to talk about this or including it in their publications or approaching us to see how right, what we can do about it. And so that's been really a wonderful experience to see that it has really arrived in this community.
Okay, I'm so sorry to stop the Q&A now. We don't unfortunately have much more time for it right now, but we will have a 30-minute open discussion at the end of Mariam's session. I now invite Mariam to please take over. And Thomas, can you please share her presentation? So Mariam is going to take us through a project that GVLIP has recently concluded. And I think I'll let her take it away. There you go. Thank you so much, Mariam. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chandrama. Good morning, everyone. So nervous and excited to be here today. So please excuse me if I make any mistakes or if you hear some quivering in my voice. I want to start with saying, Florentine, that was amazing. It was so inspiring. I was scribbling notes. I have so many questions for you at the end of this too. I loved the quotes that you used. A lot of the concepts and the values you discussed are going to be reiterated throughout my bits of the presentation too. So thank you so much for sharing your experience. So today I will be talking about honoring, engaging, and building reciprocal relationships and its pathways to kinship. Now, some of you may feel this is familiar, and it might be, because it's very similar, if not very close to the presentation I gave last year at P2P. However, I was given this amazing opportunity by AMSA to come back and talk a little bit more in detail about some of the work that we did. So bringing in the learnings, but through actual frameworks and examples that are practical and real. So I'm hoping to be able to share that with you today. Please note that I come from an imperfect place of learning. I am not an expert. I'm hoping by sharing our failures and our successes that you'll be able to see some of the alignment that you have as well. Oh, I noticed that just popped up. Please feel free to ask questions throughout this process. Whether it's even just commenting and saying disagree, agree, can you elaborate more? It helps because with everything being virtual, I can't see your faces. I don't know, I don't see the nodding or the disagreeing. So it would be wonderful if you could engage and ask questions, whether it's through the chat function or in the chat box itself. I would like to begin today by letting you know that I am coming to you from the sacred, traditional, unsurrendered, and stolen land of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Squamish, and Musqueam peoples. Today, as I recognize traditional, unceded, stolen territory, I express respect, gratitude, and appreciation for the Indigenous peoples whose land we live on without permission. It is recognition of their presence, leadership, and brilliance, both in the past and the present. As we actively seek truth and we strive to fulfill the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, it is important that we continue to build relationships with First Nations and Indigenous communities and engage in ongoing self-education. A little bit about myself. I'm Mariam Bilgrami. My pronouns are she, hers. I am a Pakistani Canadian. I have recently accepted the position of Senior Manager of Innovation, Engagement, and Advocacy at Diversity Community Resources Society. The Surrey Local Immigration Partnership will continue to be in my portfolio, so I'm very excited about that. Also recruiting for a project manager, just thought I'd put that out there for the Surrey LIP. Thank you very much, Carolina. I also love travel, yoga, plants, eating, and my family. And the reason I'm sharing that with you is because I really would like to humanize myself before I go into this conversation. It's important for you to know who I am, just as much as it was important for me to know who I am before I began this important work. I am also an uninvited guest and settler on these lands. I am learning every day to vocalize the purposeful harms of the past and those that currently persist, and am committing to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of respectful and reciprocal collaboration. This is especially important when working towards relationship building and dialogue between newcomers and Indigenous peoples. But this is not something I came into the LIP knowing how to do. And as you'll see as we go along, I've made a lot of mistakes. There's been a lot of learning and a lot of unlearning. And a quick example of that is, when I became a homeowner, I walked around telling people that I'm a homeowner now, whereas recently I've been informed that that's not the correct term. I am an artificial title holder because the land that I'm so-called own, I took it or I bought it from someone who doesn't have permission to sell this land. This isn't even their land. So understanding your social location and identity in spaces before you begin to do this work is very, very important. And you'll see as we go through the next few slides why. So I'd really like to start today off by sharing this amazing quote by Michael Kelly Gabriel, who is a Kwantlen Cultural Ambassador, and he lent us his beautiful words for the Surrey First Peoples Guide for Newcomers. And this is the project and initiative that I will mostly be referring to when I talk through how we build these relationships. And so as Michael Kelly said, we start our gatherings by singing a song to thank our guests for traveling to our ceremony. This opening song plays another purpose as well. It is meant to ground the guests so we can all work with one heart and one mind. The word for this is letsamot in our language, working with one heart and one mind for the good of the people. Right, so how did it all begin? I started with the Surrey LIP in 2020, and this is the theory of change and the logic model that was presented to me as the beginning of the entire project itself. So as you can see, we proposed under the proposed activity of bridging local Indigenous and newcomer communities. We were meant to have roundtables, and our outputs were going to be 2 Indigenous and newcomer community roundtable meetings per year, the First Peoples Guide for Newcomers, which is what we released as the Surrey First Peoples Guide, as well as an active reconciliation strategy that we are now working on for release this fiscal year. So related to that, our immediate outcomes that we had assumed at the time we would have would be linkages created between settlement service providers, local First Nations and Indigenous community groups, and our intermediate outcomes, which are closer to 3 to 5 years, we had hoped that newcomers and local First Nations and urban Indigenous communities in Surrey enjoy mutually respectful and meaningful relationships. Now, as you'll see from the layout of this theory of change / logic model, this is all assumptions that we were making at the time that the Surrey LIP contract wasn't even held by our organization yet. So this is at the proposal stage. This is what we said we would do. So how do we do it, right? So this is one of the slides that you're going to see is repeated from P2P, and I am putting it back in here because I feel like it's so important. It was one of the key factors, key learnings that we had, which is, how do we cultivate safe spaces? How do we ensure that the work that we're doing is approached from a decolonized lens? And, I'm very open and happy to admit when I'm wrong. And one of the pieces of feedback that I got from folks from the P2P presentation was, okay, yes, we love this, but how did you do it? So I'm hoping now to go into a bit more detail with you folks as how did we achieve step 1? So how did we do it? We intentionally sought out local Indigenous partners. And before we did any of that, we took a step back and really reflected. And I keep saying we because I'm talking about the project management team at the Local Immigration Partnership, but also the members of the Surrey LIP Council and any of the folks that were involved with the work that we were doing. So whether that's community-based, stakeholder-based, or folks that are actually working there. And we talked about what is our role? Who am I and why am I doing this work? And what are the things that I need to remember when I'm stepping into these spaces, when I'm asking for anything, consultation, engagement, who am I and where am I coming from? It was also equally as important for us to understand history. So yes, Canadian history at large, but also local history and land-based history, and becoming more deeply aware and acknowledging the experiences that have shaped the social context that we're going to be working under and in. We also understood that for any of the work to begin, we had to establish ethical spaces for dialogue. So common interests and points of differences were equally celebrated, and we really made sure to seek, ask, and then report back as to what we respectfully learned from those engagements and those consultations. So very intentionally seeking out, partners, and then ensuring that with those partners, we're intentionally seeking their opinions. And we really tried to create true consultative processes. So not just seeking and engaging with partners after we'd received funding or once the project had to begin, but from the point of when we are starting to even consider seeking the funding. So approaching the partners, speaking to them about what are your priorities? What do you think is important? How do you think this should be? What should the compensation look like? And what are we missing? We repeatedly asked, we repeatedly listened, we repeatedly reflected and continued to change what we were doing and what we were asking for. We also ensured that the approach is one of understanding and not just asking for the sake of knowing, because of the way we are required to report and a lot of the impact that we have to show, sometimes it can switch from, mutual relationship into just give me so I have something and then not doing anything with it. So it ends up in a report format, sitting on someone's desk or saved as a document on your laptop, and then that's it. It doesn't do anything more. So we really learned how to loop back after consultations, and we've kept record of when we haven't done that. So that also shows us where our system, our internal system is failing. We've really valued lived and non-traditional experiences in education and understood that decolonizing approaches means so much, and we know so little about it that it's going to be an every single day process. It's something that we try and do as often as possible and reflect on as often as possible, because we just have to accept that things are not always going to work out as planned. And that's difficult to do when you have funder deadlines, when you have to spend the money by a certain point, when you can only spend the money on certain things. It really creates this very complex environment of trying to fit things in, as Florentine said, into a system, while also trying to make sure that you're doing all the things that you are committing to doing and holding those values to you. So don't expect a certain outcome, timeline, or result beforehand, right? This is something, I literally have this printed out and put up on my desk because we are bound by certain constructs. We have no choice, that there's certain things, there's certain deadlines that have to happen a certain way. But when you're trying to have respectful, ethical relationships with folks that you're engaging in consulting with, and you're saying that this is a collaborative engagement and it's built on respect and valuing lived and other experiences, you also have to understand that it's not always going to fit under the box that you have, right? That's a box that you're bringing to the table on it within that relationship. So how did we do it? So we reached out to those who these initiatives were for from the beginning. So we started before we even proposed these initiatives, developed those initiatives together, proposed them together, meaning that even the compensation was decided together. We had very open and trusting discussion, really, really, really clear and transparent about what it is that's happening, why you're thinking of doing this. And one of the things that we learned is that time is crucial for developing these strong and positive relationships. So allocating sufficient time and resources for ongoing consultation and making space for iteration and change, it was one of our biggest learnings. It was really, really key to be able to build that in, even into our proposals. So now any of the future initiatives that the GVLIP proposes, we build in time for consultation. We also keep our outputs and outcomes iterative, and we make it very clear that what will be put out will be based on the feedback and the information that we get from the communities that we are serving. So we're no longer saying you're going to get exactly A, B, and C as a result. We say we're going to consult, collaborate, iterate, and what you will get back is what is asking for. So that really changes the way that even our proposals are written. This is how we build trust and true partnerships. And we are so fortunate to have been able to do that because of the work we've put in the last year and a half. And as you'll see as we go along, the funding that we've now received, it's shown our partners that they can trust us and that everything that we've said we would do, we have done so to the best of our ability. And because we've stayed open to change and iteration, our partners have done us same or given this right back to us, right? They've been very open and understanding when there are certain restraints and constraints that come up as they do in our sector. Also, so important, right? This is going to go back to what I just said, talking about solving the right problem, not the one that's being funded or being assumed. And this is, again, something that as a sector, we struggle with this, because as soon as there's something that's new and interesting or a buzzword, that's what's going to receive all the funding. And we as a sector need to find out ways to just negate that. No, we're not going to step up and just fund what's being funded. Oh, I'm sorry, I just gotta, please repeat those pillars. Right, okay, I will get back to your question. It was essentially talking about making sure that we are solving the right problem, not the one that's funded, not the one that's assumed. It's mostly about coming back and saying, as a sector, collectively saying that this is maybe what's being funded right now, but this is what the community is saying is needed. And so it's a tough balance, and it's complex, because obviously we'd like to grow, we'd like our portfolios to grow, but at the same time, if we're meaningfully and intentionally doing this work, it needs to be reflective of emerging needs as opposed to what looks good in the moment. Right, so a quick discussion on equity-centered design, because I can't move forward without talking about this. A lot of the work that we do now at the Surrey LIP is based on human and equity-centered design. And one of my favorite definitions is equity-centered design is the practice of purposefully involving minoritized communities throughout a design process, with the goal of ensuring their voices directly affect how solutions will address the inequities at hand. Equitable design acknowledges that equity doesn't happen by chance, but with intent and focus. So essentially, what this definition is telling you is that from the beginning, you're approaching communities that you're working with. You're not walking into it with an intention or an assumption. You are having conversations, just regular conversations and discussions, and based on what they are telling you, you are taking that back and trying to then make sure that whatever initiatives, projects are funded are led by those communities, are fed by those communities, are compensating those communities, are benefiting those communities. Also, one of the things that I want to quickly add here is that research highlights that starting early and slowly is a strong indicator for future success, because essentially what it does is it changes the process from being just a process and turns it into more effective and trusting partnerships, and removes the whole consultative only piece and creates a true and real collaboration. So, the importance of changing from consultative to collaborative also fosters central decision-making, or takes away from it, and also adds in the fact that, we have to keep in mind that consultation fatigue is a real thing. And anytime you are just repeatedly going back and trying to just ask and consult and say, we need this from you, we need to know this from you, we need this, we need that, there is consultation fatigue that occurs, and you cannot expect folks to just continuously give when they don't feel that the relationship or the partnership that you have with them is respectful and reciprocal, and coming from a place that is not tokenistic. And I think I'd like to add this piece here. I was going to add it in the end, but I would like to add this here, is that really learning that everything is a system allows you to then look at everything from an aspect that you may not do so. Like I didn't understand that everything was a system, including things in my personal life. But now that I do, it really gets me to ask those big questions that, yes, they will cause discomfort, and yes, they will disrupt, but they're the ones that change things. So who is this benefiting? Why is it benefiting them? Who isn't at the table? Who is it not benefiting? So continuously asking those questions can only start to happen once you start looking at almost everything as a system. So step 3, incorporating respect, concern, and justice. This is, I won't go into too much detail here, because I know all of us are very values aligned in this space. So I know that incorporating respect, concern, and justice is something that we just, we bring into our practice on an everyday basis. But if we can move over to the next slide quickly, I will talk to you about how we've really tried to do that at the Surrey LIP now. The biggest piece is informed consent. And informed consent is beyond just saying this is what this is for. It's actually moving into, this is what we have proposed. This is the funder. This is why we believe the funder is funding this. This is the outcome that we hope to have. And we really, really hope that we're able to achieve this, because that is one of the bits of impact, or that's the outcome that we promised the funder that we're going to achieve. So truly, truly showing from beginning to end what it is and why we're doing what we're doing. So real informed consent to the community, and in first language as much as possible. And exactly what Florentine said about also moving away from saying, well, we using so-called funder language, and really talking about things in more of a narrative that we would normally speak to each other about things. when we don't, providing folks with the opportunity to look and seek and find what it is that you're truly speaking of. So respect for persons, securing free, informed, ongoing consent, understanding that people have distinctive cultures and identities, even within an umbrella community. So that is so, so important to know, and something that I'm still learning. Respect for community customs and codes for practice, concern for welfare, understanding that there's interconnection between humans, their stories and cultures, and their intergenerational identities. Imbalances of power and unintentional harm. I purposefully pause when I speak of these two things because this is something I struggle with on a daily basis. It's so important to understand power in all aspects. So power in this space, I'm not an expert, but because I'm the one speaking, there's an imbalance of power immediately created. So many of you on here in this space right now have so much more knowledge and probably a very deep understanding of all of this already. But there's an assumption that I'm the expert because I've been asked to speak, and that's not true. So even in this space, when we can see that, imagine going into these consultative or these engagement practices, and you're the one that's facilitating those conversations, there's an automatic imbalance of power. How do you overcome it? I'm not sure yet. The first step that I've started to take is acknowledge it. Speaking about it the way I'm speaking about it today, coming into those spaces and seeking advice from the folks that we're engaging with and saying, what can I do to ensure that there isn't an imbalance? Or if there is one, how can I address it? How can we overcome it together? And what are the things we can do? Whether it's me not even being invited into the tables anymore, which FYI, our Surrey LIP, Surrey Youth Newcomer Council, I'm not invited to those meetings anymore. It's a by invite only for me. So they meet regularly and then they invite me and then they ask when they have any questions for me or if they need something from me. So imbalance of power is important, and also really understanding unintentional harm. So this piece, is something, again, like I said, I'm still learning this, but specifically in the case of Indigenous peoples, there's so much abuse that has stemmed from research in the past, right? That's including, there's a lot of misappropriation that has happened of sacred stories and songs and artifacts. There's been devaluation of Indigenous peoples' knowledge as primitive or superstitious, which is so ridiculous. And there's been severe violations of their community norms. There's also been failure to share data and resulting benefits back, and dissemination of that information has deliberately misrepresented and stigmatized entire communities. So it's being so aware of the fact that there can be so much unintentional harm caused by some of the work that we do. And for us specifically, it was ensuring that we're not perpetuating stereotypes and generalizations centered upon the basis of colonized collection and interpretation of data. So mutual, reciprocal, and collective collaboration. Could we skip to the next slide, please? So how did we do this? It may seem really simple by these 4 or 5 points, but I promise you it's not, because when we say asking what do you need and want, it's not asking once. And it's not asking twice, it's asking every single time. What do you need? What do we need? What do we want? What is missing? And there's a difference between what's needed and what's wanted. And I really believe that we are at that point now that we should be moving past need and getting to want as well. There's been, even though a lot of the needs haven't even been addressed yet, but we can't get stuck on that. There has to be, communities have to be able to say to us that, yes, we do need this, but we also want this, and for us to be able to provide that back to them. We should be asking continuously, how is the work that we're doing benefiting you and your community? And if it isn't, how can it? What else can be done? What can be changed? And Florentine already said this, but compensate, whether that's through money, which, by the way, always do it through money, but then also by making sure that you're putting people into positions of power and decision-making themselves. So it's not always consultative where you're making decisions through consultation and engagement, but also ensuring that you're saying, right, that you're amazing, this is amazing. How would you like this? We're opening up, this position's coming up. Would you like this position? Asking for funding to actually have these full-time positions or or advisory hours that are paid, putting people into boards and advisory councils as well, not just, from a distance as a faraway consultative group. Community engagement, should benefit participating communities in various ways. So as we already talked about compensation, and training and local hiring, recognition is equally as important, and return of results. So always taking back what you've gotten out of it, so key. Seek relevance and stay iterative. I will use that word over and over again, because if there's one thing I've learned above and beyond everything else, is that when you stay iterative, that is a true step towards decolonizing, because the typical colonized version of doing things is, here it is in black and white, here's the box, build the box and set it down and walk away. And that's no longer how we are going to be doing our work, because it is ineffective and it doesn't actually reflect true needs. I feel like I've been talking a lot. Okay, moving on to the next slide, please. Honoring people's ways and practices. Next slide, please. How do we do this? Well, you know what? Ask. The best way to do this is to ask. Be vulnerable. Don't be afraid of asking the wrong questions. I have asked so many wrong questions, but because of the work that we put into developing our relationships with our partners, they know what my intentions are, and they have felt safe enough calling me in when they needed to, letting me know when I was right or wrong. And how I've responded to that, like inside, I might be dying of guilt and embarrassment, but from the outside, I make sure that I thank them for saying what they've said to me, and walk away from that looking and reflecting back and saying, okay, I was wrong, but now I know how to do it right. And then talking about it like this, with my coworkers, with my peers, and sharing that we're not always going to be right. And there's going to be so many things that we get wrong, but rather than just not doing it at all, or doing it in just the most base way possible, we need to move beyond that and really, really ask. It takes time, and we know that recognizing and understanding and appreciating differences is not something that we have been taught, because we've always been taught that everyone's the same, like we're all the same, and that's great, but that's not true. We're not all the same, and our differences are what makes us who we are, and we really should be appreciating them. And then the last piece, do not take advantage of resiliency. It's so ridiculous that resiliency, that word, is now used as this big badge of honor, but the truth is that to be resilient, it means you've had to go through something really horrible to get there. So resiliency is not a badge of honor. It should not be taken advantage of. It is not something we should be calling communities and saying, they're amazing, they're so resilient. No, we need to move beyond that and actually say resiliency shouldn't have to exist, because nobody should have to go through anything to get there. So stop, we really need to try to stop associating resiliency with brilliance on its own. Share, communicate, and explore. So how do we do this? So one of the things that we did one of the things that we do, I should say, anytime that we're building relationships with any communities, is work together to go develop a relationship framework agreement. So we actually, and that's just a fancy way of saying literally putting down in words what we're expecting from our relationship with each other. It could literally be 5 things. It doesn't have to be a big fancy document. But when you take the time and the effort to talk about what your relationship is to each other, and what you hope to come from it, and how often you'd like to reflect back to see if it's working, and if it's not working, it's almost like a terms of reference that you have for the relationship that you're building with your partners. And that can include things like that informed consent piece that I talked about, like the purpose of the relationship, what the intent and outcomes, as I already said, are, and what happens when things don't work as you expect. Right? It's so important to have that discussion as well, is that how will you handle those situations? And then being able to make sure that the people that you're working with are comfortable enough to ask you who is the funder, but also why are they funding that? What is their purpose? Why is this something that suddenly has so much money being put into it? And you have to be able to answer those questions effectively. So also, right, I forget my own slides. Who is taking what and how much responsibility is important. And I love how I've written be true to that framework, and right underneath that, I've written be open to change. It's because of the fact that, yes, there's a framework to guide you, but also remember that it's just there to guide you. And when I talk about iteration, it means change. You have to be open to change. Things will change around you and you're going to have no choice. And as you'll see in the next upcoming slides, we've had to take a lot of steps back and change a lot of things. And of course, as I mentioned, transparency is key. Right, so responsive funding. So we talk about responsive funding, continuous reflections, and the last piece, which is progressive leadership. So how do we do that? Flexible funding arrangements are so important to support any kind of engagement with Indigenous and other communities, both in terms of time and activities. As I've said already, engagement is a long-term process, and which in itself entails a responsive funding structure. So basically saying leniency is required to support a fulsome engagement process. Agencies like ours that want to work with Indigenous and other populations require funds dedicated to respecting and honoring specific needs, such as protocols and traditions. This can take the form of elder honoraria, physical gifts for sharing knowledge, and traditional tobacco use for use during prayers. And also things like transport, childcare, special dietary requirements, and requests compensations for time. To nurture and sustain relationships, it's so important to incorporate a process of continued reflection. So, having like a critical analysis checkpoint. I know that's just basically a fancy way of saying every step of the way, building in these little loops that you come back and you analyze and reflect. And ensuring that your outcomes are adaptive to the feedback that you're getting from those loops, that you are being, obviously having your long-term goals and impacts while also being responsive to current and shorter term and emerging needs. So again, this all comes back to this iterative piece, being able to observe and reflect and then question whether it's working or not. Sharing power and support and innovation is equally as important. So anytime funding opportunities pop up for us, we are really now trying to reach out and collaborate and or even pass on those opportunities to others that we believe should be leading this work, as opposed to just taking it on ourselves. And, really trying to not have authoritative imposed solutions in any of what we recommend. If we're really seeking to equitably engage with people, we require leadership that is committed to doing things differently without the context of bureaucratic silos. And I know that the nature of the work that we do in the sector that we work in, it's difficult to have that. But when you have a participatory governance model where power is shared and innovation is supported, you can really, really encourage and incubate meaningful participation strategies within your processes. I know that this is a shift from some of the work that we do because we're typically working within short timelines, focusing on fixing problems, really have so many reports to write and budgets to monitor. But it is key for us to begin changing our systems from some aspects. And one of the aspects is to do it in this way. A progressive leader working with diverse partners will avoid authoritative decision-making or impose solutions. Rather, will look for ways to build consensus to make decisions more legitimate and meaningful. So did we get it all right? Absolutely not. And at this point, I'm going to be very vulnerable and talk to you about all our failures. I do wish we would have gotten it all right, but then maybe we wouldn't have learned anything. So, right. So the first failure, we didn't ask for enough funding. Which meant that we weren't able to compensate folks properly for the launch and the release of the guide itself. We didn't have enough money for honorariums. We didn't have enough money for community outreach. Initially, I also wasn't being hands-off enough. I was very, very new to the role, so I felt like I had to be involved in every step of the way, but I am not an Indigenous person. And if we're saying that this is an Indigenous-led project, then I'm not the one that's supposed to be approving and finalizing any of the content or anything that's going into that guide. Having good intentions is not enough. You can't, that's kind of where I learned that just because I have good intentions doesn't mean that the work that I'm doing is okay or that I'm not causing any harm. So being able to reflect on that was a huge piece that's helped me to continue to learn and improve. We cannot keep burdening Indigenous and First Nations folks with educating us without compensating them, without them being able to give their true feedback and opinions on what's going on. So I can't expect to be approaching, for example, my Indigenous consultant and saying to her, oh, we need to consult with you about this proposal that we're submitting, but then not giving her the space to turn on and say, this is tokenistic, and this is, perpetuating systemic racism towards Indigenous folks. And then for us to be able to do something with that and move past and beyond that, rather than just going back and forth with consultations, one-sided consultations. What else? I did not know how to handle deadlines, especially when the entire Indigenous First Nation, in fact, all of Canada was mourning about the graves that were discovered. We, all of a sudden, there was this cognitive dissonance that I was going through where in my brain, I said, oh no, but we have these funder needs and requirements and deadlines we have to meet, but a community is grieving. I'm not going to be coming to you and knocking on your door saying, where's that so-called document when you're going through something so big. So that I put that in as a failure because we didn't realize that. I continued to follow up even with gentleness and kindness, but that is not something that should have been happening in that moment. What else? Oh yes. The nameless Indigenous person. So I wrote that down in my notes because a lot of the photographs that were going into the Surrey First Peoples Guide, I was like, oh, it's okay. We've got the approval from the photographer, so just go ahead and put it in. We've compensated the photographer, and so we don't need to know who this person is. And I was very gently corrected that we need to stop perpetuating the nameless Indigenous person and really make that effort to name people, find out who it is, put a name, put a personality, put a story to it, because it's throughout history, it's been perpetuated in paintings and in photos. And so we have to move past that. Ensure you're always crediting for work in photography. Consent, always get consent. People need to know where their work is going, what it's being used for, will it ever be used for anything else in the future? They need to know that, this is an IRCC funded project. So that guide is going to have that logo on there, and is that okay with them? So important. Another mistake I made was asking if I could do voiceovers on audio video for some of the recordings, because I wanted to have those recordings available in various languages. What I didn't realize is that there's enough erasure happening already of Indigenous folks and their history and their stories, and that is not something to do. But again, I was called in beautifully by my colleagues, by my Indigenous friends and colleagues, who said, we understand your intention is good, but that's not something that we think should be happening. Understanding narrative and how much language impacts everything, every single thing. So Florentine said this, and I'm just going to iterate it here. How we speak about things, how we say things, it matters. It matters because it changes our own perceptions, and it also changes external perceptions of what we are trying to say. Also, things like assuming that my ideas are the right ones just because I have good intentions, seeking approval and validation for the work that we're doing, which is completely ridiculous because this is the bare minimum of the work that should be happening anyway. So seeking outside approval and validation shouldn't be something that we should be doing. Not understanding that there are complex relationships and power dynamics in play, and that knowing social and local context and history is key to being able to facilitate this work. And I've already addressed this, so I won't go into too much detail there. And yes, now this piece might be a little controversial, and we don't always all have to agree, but I have been recently informed that we need to move past saying territorial acknowledgements to territorial announcements, because you can be acknowledging something that you also do not think is true. So moving past saying the word acknowledgement is important. Again, the aspect of narrative. And not lumping decolonization into justice, equity, and diversity initiatives, because how ridiculous is the concept of including those whose lands we are on without permission? Also, being open to being wrong, continuing to try, sitting with discomfort, and continuously seeking more. And knowing that being an anti-racist is also a continuous process, not a journey. And, you know, as in it has a beginning, because a journey has a beginning and an end, whereas a process is continuous. So the process of decolonizing oneself, our work, and our communities, and our language, it requires a daily effort. Since I'm running out of time, I'm going to skip quickly to the next slide, and I'm going to go through it as quickly as possible. So what did we get right? One of the things we've learned is to move past the theory of change to systems change, meaning true systemic change, no more band-aids, really trying to work towards long-lasting, mutually trusting and valuable relationships that result in changing the systems that have been perpetuating and holding inequities in place. Ensuring that when we do community outreach, it's intentional, we build that time into proposals, we create iterative proposals that are based on receiving true feedback. We have continued these relationships that we started from the beginning. And we, like, as I mentioned, we continuously reflect and ask, are we still benefiting from each other's relationships? Is this working for us? What else can we do? And who is missing from this space? And that understanding that for any initiatives to be considered Indigenous led and created, it must be Indigenous led and created. So Indigenous leaders and Indigenous owned organizations and companies have to be involved from the beginning, not just as an afterthought or after receiving funding, but at even the time, potentially even before considering applying and designing the initiative and project. And what this has led into, some of the successes, is that we have received funding now for taking the Surrey First Peoples Guide and truly working on systemic change for the future with the work that has already happened there. So to put it into a nutshell for you, we are now developing a curriculum around the Surrey First Peoples Guide, which can be used by language instruction for newcomers, by frontline workers, by library workers, anyone that's would like to work with this guide as a curriculum to be able to share this knowledge with others, whether it's newcomers or not. They're going to be able to attend a workshop as well as receive a toolkit that's going to allow them to convert this content into curriculum to share onwards. We've also received funding to turn the guide into an audio-visual version of the guide so we can bypass any kind of literacy issues. We've received funding to convert it into multiple and various languages. We've also received funding to create an engagement strategy to be shared with other local immigration partnerships and other community providers that would like to create a guide like this for themselves. And last but not least, we've also received funding to develop, as I mentioned, a reconciliation strategy within the local immigration partnership in Surrey that we're also hoping to share out with the other LIPs so that they're able to develop a strategy for themselves. So Len Pierre from the Katsi First Nation said, the importance of documents like this First Peoples Guide, written by Indigenous people and within an Indigenous perspective, is a celebration, a progressive step in the right direction towards learning, understanding, and respecting the original and First Peoples of the lands you now call home. This incredible work was done by research and writing by Little Crane Consulting that is run by Jessica Slater. The design and layout of the guide was by Dahani Creatives. The hand-drawn graphics were by Jamie Leigh Gonzalez. Photography was by Kelsey Marchand. If you would like to see the guide, please go onto surreylip.ca. The current languages we have available are English, Punjabi, Tagalog, Mandarin, and coming soon in French, Hindi, and Korean. And of course, funded by Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada. I'd like to end today with the most beautiful words by Chief Dr. Robert Joseph. Let us find a way to belong to this time and place together. Our future and the well-being of all our children rest with the kind of relationships we build today. Thank you all so much for your time, and please feel free to reach out to me outside of here if you would need to. The next slide has all my contact information, and I'm sure it can be shared with you in the chat box as well. Thank you so much for giving me the time to speak to you about this today. I hope it was of value to you, and I'm so looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mariam. Thank you, Florentine. Both your presentations were amazing. I have goosebumps. It was so so good. And there were so many important points that you have raised. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. So I now open the floor to questions. Please you feel free to unmute yourselves, switch on your camera, and ask any questions that you would like directly to Florentine and Mariam. We want this to be an open space for everyone to ask questions and for you to know more about what they have shared.
That Florentine and Mariam, can you hear me? Yeah, that was so amazing, and my mind and is blown. My heart's open. I have actually two questions. Well, I think it's now three, but first with the presentation you just did, Mariam, working with Indigenous people and the history of Canada, you know, it's such an emotional topic as well. And I'm just wondering how you managed in a professional setting.
You know,
emotions.
It's such a great question. And when we go into these spaces, the first thing that we try to do is acknowledge the fact that these conversations are going to be emotional and uncomfortable. We try and provide folks with any kind of support that they need. So we ensure that there's multiple facilitators in the space that can then, I mean, obviously in our virtual world, we've only had virtual meetings. So they're able to go into a separate space and talk to each other about what they're feeling. We try and really get a lot of feedback from folks to make sure that how things were conducted, was it done well, what could be done better? And within the space, as those emotional conversations are taking place, we really try and tell people that when we're having these important conversations, to be able to take this opportunity as not just, okay, I'm learning about what happened, but I'm really here to make sure that this does not happen again, and that we aren't perpetuating that harm, and that we are really making a conscious effort to change so that we're moving past just the feeling of helplessness and how awful is this into helplessness. Yes, it's awful, but we're here to try and do something about it. And sometimes that helps, but sometimes it doesn't. So I have to say, we're still learning how to navigate that. Thank you for your question.
One thing I also want to add, what I think has opened up avenues, but also made things hard, is the fact that we've done a lot of this work all through meetings like this, right? And so one thing I noticed, for example, in the LIP and Greater Victoria, is that there's just so much desire to meet each other in person, because there's other ways in which we can read each other's and body language, and right, it's just so that's while it opens up opportunities to have people at the table that otherwise might not be able to show up in person. I think that is, for me, something I'm really looking forward to eventually, whenever that is, to start have these meetings and be able to connect with people on this one-on-one basis. But yeah, what you said, Mariam, I mean, thank you for your presentation. There was just so much richness to that. So thank you for that.
We have a question from Ed Allen to everyone. What is the relationship between the info that you are creating and what FN have already developed in their own voice? The AFN Summit, they have developed materials too. So I don't know who this question is directed at, so please, Mariam, Florentine.
I'm assuming this is directed at me for the Story First People's Guide for Newcomers. Please, whoever's asked that question, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. So the Story First People's Guide for Newcomers was created in collaborations with local land-based leaders and First Nations and Indigenous communities in Surrey. So it's very specific to Surrey. And if you go onto the Surrey LIP website to download the guide, you'll notice that the folks that created the guide have decided to take an aspect of oral storytelling and build that into the guide, which is an Indigenous tradition. And so almost everything that's in there is from the aspect of storytelling, speaking to an Indigenous elder or cultural leader, and then building those stories into the guide itself. So there may be a lot of overlapping information and a lot of similar things that are talked about within the developed materials, but this one is very specific to Surrey First Nation.
Thank you, Mariam. I think we have Jacqueline Williams who wants to ask a question. Jacqueline, please feel free to just unmute yourself and switch on your camera and just ask a question.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Miriam. That was a great presentation. I found it very helpful. I just had a question. You were chatting a little bit about with like proposals and grants, but also I appreciate you touched on that you can't always go in with a set timeline and set outcomes. I was just wondering, yeah, because I feel like that's a bit of a challenge when funders want the very specific outlines and timelines and tracked, but obviously that isn't always realistic or is a bit challenging when you're working with specific people groups and you really want them to kind of give the agenda and predict the outcome. So I was just curious if you could touch a bit on that challenge or maybe how you could best kind of bridge that gap a little bit.
I mean, and I think Florentine will agree with me here. I think the first thing is to really have a good relationship with your funders, to be able to speak with them in the way that I'm speaking here now, which I have. Everything that you've heard from me today has been discussions with our funders. Also, thanks to AMSA for creating that space for LIPs and RIFs to have those discussions. We've been able to say these things to them. And that means that when you have that kind of relationship, you're actually able to go back and say, yes, we said that, you know, because there is a specific funding form and a document that you're filling out that you're putting things into, we weren't able to reach that. And this is why. And again, it's because of that developed understanding, it makes it easier to do that. It's harder on us that are doing that to then facilitate those conversations, I have to admit, but it is a part of the work. This is the commitment that we're making as people that are doing this work, that it is something that we will just inevitably have to do, which is go back and say, we're not able to handle, we're not able to meet this deadline. We're not going to be able to do this by then. And so this is going to have to move. And it becomes more of a informing as opposed to asking. And because of the incredible relationships that we have developed with our funders, so far we've been able to do that with a lot of flexibility. I do understand that that's not the perfect answer because not all funders are going to be like that. But I think from the get-go, when the submissions are going in, if those conversations are had at that point, then it's easier for those things, for this type of relationship to continue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, that's very helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I mean, the same experience, like with some of these events, right? Had to they moved backwards, right? With the racism report, it took longer to write that report, and we're going to do an event. And it was supposed to happen before the end of the fiscal year, but that's an artificial, right, administrative deadline. And so, yeah, asking and sharing and just being open with the funder on why it's important to shift it and what the added benefit is to do it well rather than do it in a hurried fashion. And it has become something that when we got the funding for the research that I will do this year coming up, just to ask that question right from the start. So what will happen if we can't get it done by the deadline because of all these, right? What if we, is there flexibility? And so, yeah, then right from the start, they said, yes, we can offer this type of flexibility, right? They don't want to have a flexibility of like 5 years from now, but it's like this is sort of our understanding, like we'd like you to do it in a year, but if it's a year and a half for this project, in that particular case, sometimes funders can also protect you, right? This is the funding that I'm talking about that I'm going to do this year. It's actually a small project. And so they also want to protect you from spending 5 years on something that is actually a very small funded project, because then you can overextend yourself. So just to understand these relationship, I think that is really important.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful, both of you.
We have a question from Paulina about Mariam's land announcement. Paulina, please unmute yourself and you can ask.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you know, it's funny. I wanted to take this workshop for several reasons, but what really stuck out for me, I was like, I am going to for sure take this workshop because in your bio, you use the word stolen when you talk about where you live. And I have not yet created a land announcement in my signature, but I took a workshop where I learned that it's in the signature when you send out emails, people will want to or not want to form alliances with you from your signature. and from your land announcement. And thank you for that word announcement. I did not know that that it's now announcement and not acknowledgement. And I admit that sometimes when I read land acknowledgements, I'm like, I don't feel anything from what I'm reading, you know, I don't feel anything from this other person. So my question is, who did you ask for guidance? And Florentine, I'd love to hear if you have something to add as well. And have you ever had, because stolen is such a bold word. I have wanted to use that word, but I've hesitated. So what, do you have any experiences about people acknowledging in your announcement the word stolen?
Thank you so much for asking this. And I won't take up too much time because this is something, it's been such a difficult thing to move past just the whole the acknowledgement versus announcement piece. It's so new. I read Michelle Nahani had talked about it, Tatalia had talked about it, and I just kind of did a deep dive and started asking people that, you know, what does acknowledging mean to you? So if, you know, you're upset or angry and I say, I acknowledge your anger, but I acknowledge this, however. So acknowledgement can be something that you're saying is true or potentially is not true or is perception based. So it's very easy for me to then move from saying, okay, I'm no longer going to say acknowledgement and say announcement. I'm announcing to you what land I'm on. And as far as stolen is concerned, I've received very positive feedback, but I've also received very, very negative feedback from people saying that, oh, you're, it's so uncomfortable. And why would you start with that? And why would you create this negative environment by using the word stolen? And I'm like, that's why I do it, right? Like I'm not willing to walk on eggshells anymore. There has to be a point where you say, that's it, that's enough, and change has to come. And that can only come from being uncomfortable, being disruptive, and standing up and saying the status quo is not okay with me anymore. And the way that I can personally do it is by adding it into my bio, adding it into my signature, talking about it in these spaces, and letting people know that when I say that, I'm not coming in to fight, I'm coming in to talk. I'm coming in to discuss. I want the discussion to move beyond saying, yes, I acknowledge this, to saying, I am announcing that this is stolen. I'm saying to you that this is wrong. And so what are we doing about that? Quarantine.
Thank you for that, Mariam. Yes, I myself had not heard the announcement change there either, and I think it's absolutely wonderful. And I'm definitely thinking about that and how to include that also personally. One thing I want to add as a complication there is that in terms of what you have in your signature, right? For there also sometimes, right, you have in your signature what your organization has worked on for a long time with local nations, and so do realize that too, that some of these things have come together and right, just feel in what way you have the freedom to change some of these things. So there might be different ways in which you can incorporate that, and sometimes you might also feel like, well, this is what I need to say, and I would like to say more, and then find these ways to say that either in words or if it cannot be in your signature, say something more. What I really love for a colleague of mine is whenever he does a land acknowledgement, he always adds a learning piece. He said, and this week I learned this about our local nations. And it's such a wonderful way of seeing that process going, because as you're saying, it is a process, right? It's not something we're going to end and we're going to have it perfect. So yeah, some of that's, I think, really important also to realize. I do think that we do need to get more comfortable with being uncomfortable. Right, we have received a lot of that with the media campaign. People saying, "I love the media campaign; it's absolutely wonderful." But you use the word anti-racist, and anti sounds so anti, and sounds so critical and so difficult. And it seems like you're coming right to get in a fight with us, whereas we're saying no, right? We do want to be against racism. And so we do need to use those words and be very honest and truthful about what we're actually doing here. And so the use of the right words is really important. But to kind of teach people that it's okay if you're uncomfortable, because out of that discomfort, you get this reorientation and this changing, and that that is not right. This fear that the expectation that we're always going to end up at this level, comfortable ground, that's something we need to give up. It's also, if we're not afraid of being uncomfortable, I think it also helps break through a bit of paralysis that we sometimes have, right? So sometimes feeling really guilt-riddled can paralyze you, and you don't want to do anything that makes someone upset, and then you don't do anything. And so that's not the answer. And sometimes it all seems so much, right? I've also received those questions like, but there's so much out there and we need to do so much work. Where do we start? And so that kind of feeling of it's so huge can also paralyze you. And so any kind of getting comfortable with making a first step, and if the first step is not exactly what you'd hoped it be, and it feels uncomfortable and it's not steady, keep going. Right? Keep just going and putting these unsteady steps and step back and listen and right and go on that process and start working with your community. Yeah. So just be comfortable being uncomfortable. I think it's actually really important.
I just wanted to say, just along the lines, I love both of your presentations. It was really, really right on. After being with the LIP for 2.5 years, you guys really nailed the important bits for anybody who's new, or reminders about what to stay focused on. It was really well done, both of you. I wanted to say that, these conversations that we have and the words that we use are so important. For instance, in Chilliwack's community services, we really pride ourselves on being diverse and open, and we have our pronouns, and we have the acknowledgement or announcements. Now we'll have to try and make that update. But the wording, and they were so proud. And as an organization, we were so proud. We had it bold on every wall in every building we had. But the wording was interesting. It was that we acknowledge that we're on unceded traditional territory, and we thank these people for giving us the ability to work and play on this beautiful land. And when I mentioned it in a conversation with a project, while I'm reaching out to Indigenous people and elders, they kind of snickered. And I really had to dig, because trying to get information and no, I can tell something's off, and I really want to know what it is. It took some time for them to trust me. Finally, it came out. Can you really say the words that we're sharing the land with you? If you break into someone's home and steal their jewelry, can they then say, thank you for sharing your jewelry? So sometimes we're, like you were mentioning, good intentions. We're using words with the best intentions. And it was even uncomfortable to bring up to the committee, who was so proud of this, because they're on the right track, but the wording, it matters. And so we did get it changed, but it was a conversation. And it's funny, because outcomes, sometimes you go into something and you're thinking that you're going to have a different outcome, but a very different outcome occurs. Because like you say, when something is organic, conversations are organic. That isn't something that I went into learning. The other thing I learned is communication is very different with the different cultures. So that was a learning piece that we are still getting, and you only get it right when you get it wrong. Because when you make a mistake, and you're allowed to make a mistake, you never will do the same one again, hopefully. But you do open up that dialogue, and they are able to see that you're vulnerable and willing to learn. And I think that's a very valuable lesson. Thank you.
One thing I want to add to that is, when someone calls you on a mistake, right? That is a gift. And you really should see it not as, I've just failed, right? I should have known this. I should have not done this. Obviously, right? You're making a mistake, and there is a sense where you're going to feel you shouldn't have done that. But at the same time, see it as a gift, because they're sharing this with you. They're talking to you about this. And so the first response should really be, thank you for calling me and connecting me. And it's actually already a sign of trust, right? This is like when we have friends. Like, if there's someone you you're done with, right? And this person is not worth your energy, you do not necessarily knock on their door and say, hey, you did this and I didn't appreciate it, right? This is something that you can do with friends where you're saying, you did something, I didn't appreciate it, you hurt me. And so think about this. Someone calling on you for a mistake is the first step of trust building. And that's why it's so important that your first response is not defensiveness, but is a thank you and a listening, and then continuing from there collaboratively together. And so there was one question way above, right? What our response was when a Black person called us out on, right? The models didn't have the kind of representation that they were hoping it had, right? And instead of going and defending and saying, well, capacity and limited models, whatever, right? What you need to do is like, thank you. And also realizing that in that case, for us, it actually was important to share a little bit more about the background of the campaign, and to bring in the photographer. I really like what you were saying, Mariam, to kind of be very clear on who you are engaging. And so this was a Black local photographer that took all these amazing pictures, and to recognize this individual very, very clearly for the work that they have done, but also to kind of help understand, right, people like where we're coming from. And we are at the moment, this campaign is going to run up until 2025. And so to make sure that in the next fiscal year, right, we are indeed updating and listening and working together with these individuals to keep moving things along, right, and pulling people into this conversation about anti-racism in the workplace in our community.
I have a question.
Yeah, we have only 3 minutes, so we'll have to take one last question. I'm really sorry, but we need to sort of wrap it up in the next 3 minutes. Please go ahead.
Okay, I have a question. Because can you hear me? Okay, it's very, very sensitive, when you go to a community, Indigenous community, to, let's say, propose a project initiative. It's not really propose, is not the correct word, because I've heard from the Indigenous community that a lot of people come and say, oh, we're going to solve your problem. Oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, as if they can't do it themselves. And so in collaboration, I thought it was awesome that you both said about, talked about collaboration and do it together. And so what would be the approach when you have a project initiative? How would you approach an Indigenous community? First contact.
So my recommendation is to not wait, to develop the relationships now for no reason, right? Like go into it and have those relationships pre-built. So GVLIP had spent 6 years building relationships with Indigenous communities and leaders and knowledge and cultural brokers who were just told that we just want to know you. We want to be able to have these pre-built relationships with you for just because we feel it's important. And then going back when, saying, okay, well, we've been given this opportunity to apply for X amount of funding. Is there something that's coming up in your community that you believe could be supported by this amount of money, right? Or however amount, what is the amount of money or what is the outcome? So it's like, it's not waiting, right? Creating and building those relationships, not when you need them, but from before, and making sure that you're able to provide something back. So it's not just taking. I'm not sure if this is like the most helpful comment, but I think just to boil it down to a nutshell, it's really important that these relationships are pre-developed and not developed for the purpose of any one thing.
And thank you so much.
Unfortunately, there is not any more time for us to continue. I know this is something that we can discuss for a much longer time, but this is all the time that we have today. Thank you so much to Florentine and Mariam for this wonderful presentation, and thanks to all of you who have joined us today. And I hope you'll see you all at the upcoming IRCC BC Yukon Summit on the 2nd and 3rd of February. I'd also like to thank our interpreters for their time and effort, as well as our funder, IRCC, for helping us to organize this. Please follow us on social media. We will share our social media links with you on chat, and connect with us through Settlement.net. That is something that we bring out every week. And if you have any questions, comments, please feel free to share it with us on all the channels that we have shared with you. And I'm also going to share the link to the post-event survey on chat. So please take 5 minutes out of your time to share your feedback. Most of the work that we do in organizing webinars and events is from your feedback. So learning more about what you want to hear really helps us and informs our work. Thank you. Thank you so much.